Good afternoon, everyone. For those who'd like to join us, may I ask you to take your seats, please? We're about to start. But good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for joining us. And on behalf of the partners with whom we are hosting this panel, myself from the African Climate Foundation, on behalf of the colleagues from Bloomberg, Irina, and the colleagues from UNECA, who are also co-hosting this with us, we'd like to welcome you. As you would have seen, the session today is on catalytic collaborations between philanthropies and other actors on the continent in order to identify opportunities to support transitions, just transitions in particular, within the African context. And we're very happy and honored to have multiple speakers among us today with some exciting news which we will share with you shortly. But perhaps just before I start, I'll hand it over to Irene later to give us a proper overview of the context in which we are operating. But just to get us going, I wanted to perhaps throw in a number just to contextualize philanthropy's engagement for many of us in the continent. Since 2015, climate philanthropy funding in Africa has been increasing at an average of 30% per annum. And that has been a steady increase. And last year alone, we've reached 130 million in investments of philanthropies within the African continent, specifically focusing on climate-related issues. But this remains a small drop in the ocean in terms of the overall global philanthropic engagement worldwide, but also in terms of the need of the African continent. And so we wanted to really use this session to first understand how is philanthropic investment flowing into the African continent. Secondly, understand and have a dialogue really, and that's why we have also institutions that are very close to the field who work on many of these issues, but also many partners in the room today and beyond, to understand what are the opportunities where philanthropic funding can land and have an impact to support the just transition within the African continent. But perhaps before we start, or perhaps rather to hand it over to our first speaker, as I mentioned, to help us understand where are the major investments in philanthropy at the moment. And our speaker, the first speaker, is Irene from the Children's Investment, the Children's Investment Foundation, CIF with double F. And Irene Karani is the Africa Director for Climate at the Children's Investment at CIF. And she has over 28 years of experience in natural resources management, climate change-related issues, and rural livelihoods with communities in Africa. She is based in Nairobi. And I'll hand it over to you, Irene, also to share an exciting announcement with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fatan. As Fatan has said, the inflows of financing to Africa are a drop in the ocean. But what does that drop actually mean? You know, is it from global climate finance in total, or is it, what exactly is it? And actually, the situation is really concerning. Just to give you a few numbers. So total global philanthropic support is $12 billion. The Africa drop is 140 million. And look at the size of the continent and the impacts of climate shocks on the continent. And Africa keeps being told we have to leapfrog. These are words that are being used. How do you leapfrog with a drop of the investment? Okay? And being a little bit granular, who is going to assist with the leapfrogging in the energy transition? You need an enabling environment, you need core capacities to be built, you need public engagement. But let us look at the numbers that are coming to Africa on those three things. On an enabling environment, in a study conducted last year, Africa got $1.4 million. The United States got $55 million for energy transition. On capacity building, Africa got $700,000. The United States got $22 million. I think by now you're starting to see what a drop means. It is completely insignificant. For public engagement, Africa got $300,000. The United States got $135 million. So how is Africa going to leapfrog into a just energy transition when it is not the one that has, I mean, this statement, I know, it's beginning to sound cliche, Africa did not cause the problem, but we need to keep repeating it. Africa did not cause the problem. Africa needs investment, not only from development funders, but also from philanthropy. And the philanthropic engagement is quite low also, but the trend has been increasing. As CIF and working with the Africa Climate Foundation, we have been convening an Africa Funders Forum that is seeking to increase philanthropic funding to Africa, not only for energy, but for adaptation, financing, and so on and so forth. And philanthropic capital cannot replace what governments are meant to be doing. It cannot replace what multilaterals and bilaterals are meant to be doing. Philanthropic capital is meant to ignite and catalyze and crowd in funding. And so today, a group of philanthropists has come together, and we are announcing that philanthropy is going to spend over $500 million in the next 3 years for energy transition in the global south. And because somebody has to take the risk and somebody has to put their foot in. And philanthropic funding is easy to mobilize, and it gets your foot in through the door and and starts crowding in the development financing and everything else. So we are committed to this. We are a group of 9 philanthropists, and over the next 3 years, we'll be spending over $500 million in the global south for energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene. Thank you very much. Thank you also for providing us for that sobering context in which we're operating as philanthropies within the African continent. I wanted to turn to you, Priya. Priya, you're representing Bloomberg Philanthropies with us today. And as Bloomberg, you've announced recently that you will be scaling up your own investments to 15 additional African countries. And so my question to you is why? Why scaling up the investment within Africa? And the second question, which I think Irene also touched on, is the role of philanthropy needs to be catalytic. And maybe just for the audience to help understand where you see that role particularly being played. For those who do not know Priya, Priya is the India, as I said, she's with the Bloomberg Philanthropies as India Director for climate. I'll hand it over to you, Priya. Thank you.
Thank you, Faten. And first of all, I would just like to say that at Bloomberg Philanthropies, we're pleased to be joining this group of philanthropies along with the Sequoia Climate Fund and others that Irene just talked about on this initiative today, bringing together a number of different philanthropies to support clean energy transition work in Africa. I will add a couple more stats to the ones that Irene already shared with us. I think the first is that we actually worked with BNEF, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, to look into the state of renewable energy investment and transition in Africa, launched a report earlier this week focusing on Africa. And that found that of overall investment into renewable energy globally, only 0.6% is coming into Africa. And this was really shocking. I mean, I think we expected it to be low, but we were surprised by how low it was, especially given the potential that Africa has with 60% of the world's solar resources, yet only around 1.5% of existing solar capacity. And I think that gets to the question as well that you were asking, Faten, about why we're investing in Africa, why we're expanding our work here, is because we think there's so much unmet and untapped potential and so much need to really expand this work and help realize this potential, and that philanthropy can play a unique role here. Another stat that I'm going to add as well is that of all the foundation funding flowing in internationally for climate mitigation funding, only about 4% of that comes to Africa currently. So that is also something that, as we step up efforts at Bloomberg Philanthropies, the efforts that are happening with SIF and Sequoia and other climate foundations that we are working with, we really hope to see that increasing. Coming back to your question about the sort of role that you think philanthropic funding can play, the sort of catalytic role, I'd like to echo and agree with Irene that it is not a replacement for public funding. It is not a replacement for government spending or multilateral and bilateral and development funding. Those are still very much required and necessary. It's also not a replacement for private capital investment. That is also required and necessary. At Bloomberg Philanthropies, we're actually expanding our work into 25 countries globally, but of those we have chosen 15 in Africa, developing countries overall. And we see sort of two kind of strategic pathways that we're really focusing on in terms of our philanthropic funding efforts. The first is around technical capacity building, technical assistance on policy, policy design, and also building capacity locally in terms of engaging with civil society and engaging with local communities and supporting that sort of local capacity and engagement on these issues. And we're working with both sort of international organizations such as the Sustainable Energy for All and the International Solar Alliance, but then also trying to engage with local within-country groups to sort of help build capacity, and are of course also pleased to be working with the African Climate Foundation on this agenda. The second role that we see is we're working very closely with the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is a group of over 500 financial institutions committed to achieving net zero by 2050 or earlier. And this group known as GFANS has also launched an Africa network recently, which is focused on sort of bringing together African financial institutions with international financial institutions to work together on both how to mobilize capital into Africa, as well as to accelerate the sort of transition and climate planning and thinking amongst African financial institutions. And here we see that kind of philanthropy can play a role both in terms of helping on project preparation, and also in terms of kind of convening and playing a sort of bridge building role, bringing together the different actors, the different stakeholders that are required for this transition together. So we will need action from philanthropy, but also from government, also from the private sector, also from civil society and communities. And philanthropy can help kind of convene and connect all these different players together in a wider ecosystem of action that is required.
Thank you very much, Priya, I think it was very clear as to where philanthropy comes in versus other forms of finance. And it's interesting also to hear what Bloomberg has been doing. You know, we're speaking of philanthropy coming in to support and boost a bit the discussion on just transition within the African continent. And I'd like to say that it's, you know, it's not a theory. It's already happening. It's happening in practice in African countries. And the hope is to build on these experiences. But perhaps to just shed some light on what is already happening in terms of philanthropic support and in what form is that support being provided. I wanted to bring in two of my colleagues, Salim Fakir, who is the executive director of the African Climate Foundation, as well as Zira, who is in Nigeria at the moment. But before I get to you, Zira, Salim, you've been very closely involved in this process, also of the engagement of philanthropies, particularly in the South African case. And so I wanted to ask you if you could share with us some of the key highlights on how you've worked with philanthropies to unlock the funding in South Africa.
Thank you very much, and it's really a pleasure to have you all here, particularly Irene and people from Bloomberg and so on. Just to say, we have started a new foundation, the African Climate Foundation, about 2.5 years ago. I don't come from philanthropy usually. Well, I haven't actually. I don't think in my life I've actually received any philanthropy funding for all the work I've done in this arena. But I think it was a interesting process. I mean, we had the early investment from CIF, and our focus was very much on South Africa in the early phase, and really about trying to build a strategy of increasing investments in the energy transition. And I think that the experience we have in being able to mobilize philanthropy funding has been largely to witness we can move quite fast, we're flexible. We can respond to situations very, very easily. It's very hard to do that if you receive funding from a bilateral funder. Most of you would know that if you had German funding or French funding and so on. They have different mandates, different governance, and one has to obviously respect that. With philanthropy, I think a lot of it is about taking some really calculated risk, trusting the people on the ground to make the judgment calls on, often it's political and technical, and also building networks, the right ecosystem to be able to facilitate this. And I think the significance of that, both the combination of flexibility, really understanding the local context, more importantly, the politics of the local context. Most people think that climate is just a technical solution, and you solve it by providing technical answers. I have this word of PowerPoint emissaries. You know, they go around, they do PowerPoints, and that offers the answer. And actually, you have to do a lot of groundwork in building not only legitimacy for the foundations, because most African governments want you to work in a particular way with them. You have to also give them the space to lead. I think more importantly, foundations like philanthropies cannot impose themselves. They have to actually be really more in the role of supporting. And the investments we made, which is very small actually compared to what we can leverage. For example, the 2-year investment we've made in South Africa has led to an 8.5 billion deal. We are obviously now focusing on a lot more on the elements of the investment plan and the delivery of the investment plan. And we are replicating similar models in Namibia with hydrogen, doing that in Senegal and Nigeria, and I'm sure Azera will talk about that. So I think I'll just say that occupies a very important space in that early phase development. It can't cover all the, as you said, all the financial needs. There's always, when the investment reaches the scale it has, for example, on the JETP, you have to be able to mobilize other sources of funding to be able to get it to the right level.
Thank you, Salim. I often like saying, I think that to some degree the role of philanthropy is that of almost an early investor in a kind of a proof of concept almost that then can be scaled. And as Salim said, I mean, as an African Climate Foundation, we started the engagement in South Africa in particular, but we increasingly see an appetite also elsewhere on the continent, based on country specificities, because, you know, with an engagement of foundations in South Africa does not necessarily look the same as an engagement foundation in Nigeria, which has different realities. And so I wanted to bring you in here, Zira. Zira, for those who don't know him, Zira Kwage, he is at the Energy Transition Office in Nigeria. And like Salim, you do have an experience perhaps in philanthropies as well, Zira. So if you can perhaps wear both hats, but if you could, particularly my question to you is, where has philanthropy come in the case of Nigeria, and where do you see the major gap?
Thank you very much, Fatan, and apologies for joining late. I was running late from another engagement. So to discuss the role of philanthropy in just energy transitions in Africa, I think I will build on what the previous speakers have already discussed, which is the fact that philanthropy is meant to play a catalytic role, but in no way a replacement for private funding and public sector funding as well. So I'm going to speak briefly about the role of the experience of Nigeria and some of my experiences working in philanthropy across the region as well. I like to think, okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Okay, so I like to think about it as a three-step chain. The first part of that chain is really about establishing clear climate action commitments at the highest level of government. The second part of the chain is really about implementation and turning the plans into action. And then the third part of the chain is about the accountability and the accountability mechanisms needed to keep the plan in check. So the role of philanthropy, you know, cuts across these three areas. And in terms of setting commitments and you know, establishing plans for climate action, we've seen an increase in Africa over the past few years. In 2020, for example, there were only less than 10 African countries that had net zero plans or incorporated climate action into their national development plans. Now, as we speak in 2020, there are about, you know, according to ECIU, about 23 countries in Africa with net zero plans. So that shows progress that philanthropy has made in getting countries to raise their ambition by sharing lessons across countries, either within Africa or with other regions that have gone ahead. Then to the second part of the chain, which is about implementation. I think philanthropy can play an important role in developing the evidence base. So using data, models, pathways to actually inform how these plans are being implemented. Because a plan is really just a plan. It has to be broken down into sectors. It has to be broken down into actions, and then having different, you know, parts of government working towards the plan. And I think philanthropy can play an important role here. In Nigeria, for example, we've seen the role that philanthropy played in setting up the Energy Transition Office, which is designed to implement the energy transition plan that was launched last year in Glasgow. So I think this is for me, I think, a critical part where philanthropy can really step up. Because I was at an event on Tuesday this week, a CATF event, where they mentioned that about 2/3 of climate research on African countries was actually produced outside Africa with no inclusion of African-based researchers, 2/3. So that shows that there's a major gap in understanding the local context. And there's also, I think it's also an evidence of a capacity gap where I think philanthropy can increase investments. Then moving on to the final part of the chain, which is around the accountability mechanisms to keep the plan in check. I think philanthropy has played an important role over it's an area that philanthropy is quite familiar with, which is advocacy, campaigns, movements. But I think we need to start thinking beyond classic campaigns and movements and thinking about ways to institutionalize climate action in government processes, in national development plans, and whatnot. So in summary, I'll just say different countries are at different stages of this chain that I described, and a chain is really as strong as its weakest link. So philanthropy needs to really understand where they think the chain is weakest in country-specific manners, and then try to invest to build up to make the chain stronger. So I'll stop here, Fatin.
Thanks a lot, Zira, and thanks again for the reminder on the country context and the fact that interventions are not at one point. They are across a value chain, as you put it, and that we need to be very cognizant of that. So we just heard a couple of experiences concretely in terms of how philanthropy has engaged. And I wanted to turn to a couple of institutions who have a strong hold, I think, in terms of engagement in the African continent. You've been working, both Irina and the UN Economic Commission for Africa, very, very closely. You know the terrain quite well. But maybe I wanted to turn first to you, Dr. Hanan Morsi, to ask, well, UNECA has been very much engaged, including in advising African countries in how to design different aspects of the transition, including along this value chain question that Zira referred to. And I was wondering, what are the gaps that you see in terms of needs where philanthropy could potentially come on board? And the second question is, we often, as Irene and Priya mentioned earlier, we are in a situation of low philanthropic investment in the African continent. And not just philanthropic, but also in terms of investments in renewable energy. And the argument that we often hear is, there are no pipelines, there are no, so my question to you is, would you say that this lack of investment is a demand or a supply question? And sorry, for those who don't recognize her, she's Dr. Hanan Morsi, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Fatin. Okay, so maybe let's go a couple of steps back to really just kind of have an overview of the issue of the needs. Because we've been talking about the needs, but we need to quantify what we're talking about. So Africa needs $3 trillion in financing mitigation and adaptation by 2030, okay? And as you very well know, we're not anywhere near to the financing that is required. Second, in terms of the flows that we receive less than 3% of private sector financial flows for climate issues. So that says that, while the needs are humongous, what we receive is minimal. And also the role of the private sector in addressing the climate issues in Africa is 14%, while in other regions like Asia, Latin America, it's about 50%. US is 96% of the total, financing that happens. So there are, many things that are needed. We need to actually scale up and speed the financing needs in general for the continent, but we need to also crowd in the private sector to have a greater role. What are the kind of like, you know, the things, the impediments that are affecting this? There are a number of issues there. Part of it is actually risk premium. The fact that both Africa, actually sovereign as well as by default the private sector, faces a high premium. African countries pay around 250 basis points higher than other countries with the same fundamentals. So, and on the private sector, actually, even like, you know, for project finance, while Africa has lower default rate, you know, about 5.5%, other regions that have double that rate, you know, have, you know, better risk perception than the continent. So part of the issue is how do you tackle that? And then, you know, we move into the issue of what is the role of the philanthropy in this. I'd like to start by saying that actually philanthropy has already, you know, played a role already in that sphere, because they have led the way in some areas as a demonstration case. And here I'd like to, for example, mention, you know, for debt for nature swaps. It was thanks to philanthropy funding that this actually advanced in a number of countries. So they were the leaders that has helped this, you know, kind of pick up and then become, you know, able to attract others and crowd in others. So they were critical. Now we are at a stage where I was talking in other panels that, yes, thanks to philanthropy, we actually showed that this can happen. For us to move from, you know, the millions to billions, others need to follow suit, know that this model works and how they can help. So one, I think there is a critical role for philanthropy in the issue of demonstrating, leading and demonstrating with success stories what can be done, so that you can put pressures on those that think it cannot be done, and then they can come into the stage where they're providing, you know, guarantees so that this can scale up, whether it's MDBs or, you know, G7 countries and so on. Second is the issue of advocacy in terms of advancing important agendas that really need a lot of pushing. I think this is an area also that philanthropy has been quite active and quite useful. So that will need to, it's critical and need to continue. Then, of course, as we were talking about the issue of the risk perception, there's the awareness. There's the role of perhaps having this as an evidence-based studies and you know, awareness-raising campaigns on how is it that, you know, the reality versus the actual risk on the ground do not match, and showing that and communicating that in an evidence-based way. Then the other things where the philanthropy, I think, can help, and there is a huge room, like, you know, for many players, including them, are issues of the preparation, as you mentioned before. So ECA, we held a regional forum in preparation for COP to look at projects that are like, you know, that we can put forward. There were like, you know, 200 projects that were proposed to kind of like, you know, to be reviewed and to link up with investors. And this was very useful because not only it showed which ones, I mean, a subset, a small subset, you know, got interest, but it was very important to get the feedback for those that are proposing these projects on what exactly they need to do to attract investors, to be more bankable, and to move forward. So I think part of perhaps what the philanthropy can help with is the preparation stage of these projects, capacity building, and you know, how to ensure that they are more successful in terms of being bankable, in terms of connecting with investors and what the investors are looking for in the design of the project. And then another area that they can, perhaps consider are issues of, what is holding back currently the private sector are the issues that they need, more de-risking, whether it's equity investment, whether it's guarantees, credit enhancement, instruments. So perhaps it's an area where, philanthropy can think, how they can play a bigger role to start crowding in the private sector and bring to scale. So these, I think, are really some of the key things that I see really a huge scope for engagement from philanthropies in, but we have to acknowledge that they have been already critical in some of these issues. Thanks.
Thank you very much also for that reminder, but I think a number of pointers here in terms of where philanthropy can come in, and I might come back to you, Priya and Irene, later on for some reflections. But let me bring you in, Elizabeth. So Elizabeth comes to us from IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. You're Director of Planning and Program Support in the Executive Office. And IRENA has been very active, particularly in engaging on the rollout and a scale-up of renewables across the African continent. You've worked on issues such as, the whole project preparation, but you're also doing much more on data. I often say the reports from IRENA to me are the go-to reports in terms of understanding the context of renewables in Africa and the challenges related to that. So, Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you, what are, based on your experiences in these areas, what are the gaps that you see and the challenges, particularly for the African countries, and where philanthropy can support?
Thank you, Fadan, and thank you, everybody. Very nice to see you, a lot of friends in this room. I was listening to everybody, and I have a benefit of your input to reflect on what we're discussing today. And every one of us mentioned statistics. And I'm going to add one more, because Priya, you mentioned how surprised you were with the flows, so the percentage of flows going to Africa. In January, we released the African market analysis. And in the last 20 years, globally, almost $3 trillion were invested in renewables globally. Africa got 60 billion. I was so shocked. I thought it was a mistake. There was a zero missing. 60 billion. It's 20 years. It just boggles the mind. And I think there's a lot more of this information that really should be shocking and unacceptable to all of us. But we will do something. All of us want to do something because we understand that there is a gap. And so this is where this really unattractive thing like data collection comes into play. It's just not something that a minister can come and say, oh, this country supported data collection for something. It's just not attractive. And where we see a huge gap is in the off-grid sort of decentralized data resource. It just doesn't exist. It's very anecdotal. The World Bank is doing some work. We're trying to do some work as well, especially to show the business case of renewables, how they create jobs, how they use for productive use, to really have statistics and not just anecdotal newspaper articles, how a woman in the mountain in Kenya has a mobile phone business because she has a solar panel. And it's true, and it makes a difference, but we should understand how that happens, how many of these systems exist, and how we can scale it up and make it bigger and better for everybody. So I think this is something that, because it's invisible and not attractive for otherwise financing, to really trigger, train people, institute systems, and put this foundation in place that the governments can later on build upon and actually integrate in the energy planning. And this is what brings me to the second point. We work with the WHO on the rural electrification. And so there is so many facilities that just simply have no electricity. And part of the problem was that Ministry of Health does not fund or plan for energy, and Ministry of Electricity or Energy, they just don't have this on their radar because it's off grid. It's somewhere in remote area. So it wasn't even that the people didn't want to do it or whatever. It just wasn't featuring in any of the plans. So having some of these linkages and understandings is really going to help to solve some problems. The second part that I want to flag is around project facilitation. You're absolutely right, 100% agree with you that this has to be brought to bankability, but it has to go a step further. This is what we're trying to do. The renewable projects are small. They're like small and medium size, and like private sector investment will just not come. They're not interested in a small run-of-the-mill project in Kasese in Uganda. They're just not interested in it. And so helping project developers and governments in many instances to develop these project information notes, to bring them a little bit more forward and bring them closer to where financial institutions and some innovative financing would actually pay attention and more maybe enable aggregation and a larger scale investment. I think that would be extremely useful. We have some experience with it. It's not easy, but it's also the learning things that come from it that can be fed back and amplified. And then the last point I want to make is around innovation. And Zira mentioned that some of the leapfrogging revolution will happen through entrepreneurship. And this is not technology transfer. This is not something that's going to come from the global north. This has to happen on the ground in circumstances when people are living and inventing things for themselves. On Tuesday, we're going to have the Energy Day, and we're bringing somebody from Ghana to speak about what they're doing with renewables. They don't think about where this energy is coming from. They're looking at technology and what purpose it can serve. There is so much innovation, and putting some philanthropic money in the areas where there are these small incubators, entrepreneurial sort of initiatives to amplify that, to empower people to innovate for themselves, for their circumstances, for their needs, and amplify these networks and connect innovators around the continent to actually share experiences and be linked to each other and to innovate for their circumstances. I think that would be phenomenal contribution together with the entrepreneurial innovations around, energy system, decentralized system, which really are African. They will not come from the global north. So that would be my three things that I think you could really make a big difference.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And also for a reminder that when we speak of support, it's not only to bring the external into Africa, but also to amplify and support the ecosystem that's already in the continent. Before I come back to both Irene and Priya, I just wanted to check in the room if there were any questions or comments. There are few, all right. So I'll allow some time just for questions. I see 3 hands, so we'll take them in one go. Allow the panelists also to reply to them, and I'll throw in my question.
Thank you so much. My name is Marcy from Kenya. I really want to participate in this interesting discussion on philanthropic funding. I want to agree that there are some small gaps that makes it difficult for African countries to even be able to qualify for funding, especially the preparedness level. So if we can be supported in the areas of getting prepared to be able to appreciate or to be able to absorb any other funding that comes, that could be an area that philanthropic can go in. Institutional support, capacity building, and preparedness areas in terms of like preparing action plans and compliance issues that have blocked many African countries from accessing other funding. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Mtembukazi. I am from South Africa. and I'm really glad to be here representing the youth that is in the Global South. I have a question for the gentleman that is from the African Climate Foundation. I find it very interesting that there is this new foundation, more especially in South Africa. I was trying to see if when you were speaking, you were making a note about taking calculated risks to make judgment calls with people on the ground. And I'm just quite interested in the types of networks that you're trying to build in those spaces, be it the stakeholders that are from the local grounds, since it's more intimate with the civil society, and just building more on that. And just one more question for Elizabeth. Could you please outline the guidelines that are more crucial in terms of capacity building and implementation action, more especially for projects in local communities? Thank you.
That was it, or did we miss somebody? Razan. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Razan. I'm from Cape Town, and I'm with the Open Society Africa. A few days ago, there was another discussion here around funding with the EU and Africa, and it was interesting that the representative from the EU was saying that there aren't enough big plans or big projects coming from Africa, things worth funding. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, if that really is true. And then to the colleague from Nigeria, you're right, I think there's a lot of, even the recent IPCC report pointed out that so little research comes directly from the continent. And I'm just wondering what can be done to do that, including with Elizabeth, with your institution, which obviously also does research that we all go to. How much investment do you make in local knowledge and local researchers in terms of that data? Because that's important, right? That data is used in terms of the types of projects. And if it's not been done locally, then it means it's again thought of and determined in the north, and the implementation plans then decided that way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Let me perhaps throw in my own question, following on also what Hanan said earlier. And I'd like your reflections, both in terms of the distinction between, for instance, impact investments and the role of philanthropy there versus other types of philanthropies, and just perhaps to outline where some come in and where others are not in a position to come in. Maybe let me start with I was going to say from that corner, since today the males are in a minority, so I'll honor you. Maybe to you, Zira, first.
Thanks for empowering us. Yeah, so to the question on, I think the first question was one about absorption capacity. And from working in philanthropy, it's a question that we've always had. What is the absorption capacity for grants or philanthropic funding in Africa? And maybe Irene would be able to shed more light on that. But I think we pay too much attention to that instead of just actually funding and building. I think it's more about a hesitance from the global West than anything else. That's just my personal view. But I would love to hear what Irene thinks about that. Then on the second, there was a question from OSF there on how to actually close the research and data gaps. I think I'll respond to this in two parts. One is on raising the existing voices, and then the second is on building new voices and new capacity. So a lot of research, a lot of data already exists in Africa. The challenge is that it's not in formats or in platforms that are easily usable for meaningful analysis. In some cases, it's published as PDFs and kept in academic institutions or government agencies. So I think the first step for philanthropy is to understand what exists at the moment and how can we make use of what is available as a first step. Then alongside that, which is the second step, is then to build new capacity on innovative modeling techniques, because the world is moving ahead. You know, blockchain is being used now for Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 assessments in Canada, US, and Europe. We need to bring that capacity to Africa. And then, you know, that capacity building needs to cut across sectors and not only focus on energy or where we have, you know, more existing funding going to. So I think I'll stop there.
The next gentleman. Okay. Thank you. I want to respond to your question, but I want to frame it in a way where there's a historical problem of selection bias. And I want to give you an illustration of the problem. So for example, if you look at fintech investments in Africa, and first of all, a lot of the venture capital funds tend to give it to expatriates based in Africa. This is really interesting. Very little of that, and I talked to some of them, particularly Nigerian fintech entrepreneurs. They really struggle to break the selection bias problem. And I think what's different with having a foundation in Africa is that we can break that selection bias by actually creating, through the network-based model and strategy, to find, and because we can take a little bit of risk, we can potentially work with people to unlock innovation and really amazing ideas that are out there, because the continent is so diverse and rich. It's the ability to be able to create that potential for those ideas to flourish and to scale up. So we as a foundation, we try to diversify. We have to work on a big idea. Usually the strategy of trying to work on too many ideas doesn't work. You have to try, or it might just crowd out, because you end up giving too small money to too many different things that never really get to scale. So you have to choose a big transformative idea and build an ecosystem around it. And it's different layers: government, it's business, it's civil society, on the grassroots level. And you have to try to push the idea, have a 5-year vision for it, and you try to push it as hard as you can. That's the way we think about the jet piece. It's a way of crowding. And what philanthropy funds do is that once you can prove an idea and it has momentum, you can attract a lot more other funding into the space. We've seen that in South Africa with the JETP. So I think this idea of breaking the problem of selection bias is what we seek to try to achieve. We have different models. If people can't run an operation, we fiscal host them. We can actually support them because we want the best people to run with the best ideas. They don't want to handle administration. We can try to create structures where they can do that. We don't expect people to try to go through all the verification of actually due diligence, of actually having a structure and not being able to get the funds to support them. You're more likely to get that with bilateral institutions and so on. So the philanthropy space can occupy a unique way to drive innovation. And we have different flexibilities to be able to innovate in how we can operationalize it.
Thank you, Salim. Hanan, I'll let you answer this controversial question perhaps from Razan on, does Africa, the argument we hear from bilaterals, for instance, is that there isn't much to invest in Africa, and also it's a question to you,
Elizabeth. I think the issue relates to what we had mentioned earlier about the bankability of the projects, how it's put together, how it's designed, how it's structured, and then the experience on what is required. So are there projects? Yes, but are they, do we have enough volume of bankable projects? No, that's something definitely we need to work on. That's the whole discussion, and that's why we're having these forums that I've mentioned earlier that we did in ECA ahead of COP to bring that to the table to get feedback for those that are proposing projects on what exactly, what didn't attract the potential investors to consider their own proposal. And we need to do more of that, and we need more of the technical assistance to bring to scale the projects and the capacity in the continent. But I wanted to also say something in general, like for as an, you know, in terms of approach for philanthropy. I think it's very important to be catalytic. It's not just about the philanthropy like coming in, but it's also about bringing the other, you know, partners and financiers and so on to what also they are bringing. This matters. So playing a catalytic role will be key. And of course, I totally agree with my colleague here who mentioned the issues of innovation. Absolutely. That's why, like, you know, this is why they need sometimes to kind of lead the way in supporting things that can be transformative. And definitely that's part of like innovative projects. And totally agree with what was said earlier, that innovation takes a different, you know, form and shape. Like, you know, innovation that is done for US and Canada is not going to work for Africa. So it needs to be homegrown to actually work for the continent. And that's why what we had before with, like, you know, mobile banking in Kenya was a solution for what they were going through, but then actually others replicated. So, you know, having these domestic, locally grown solutions and innovations will be really key going forward.
Okay, I will very quickly squeeze a few things. On the large-scale projects, I think oftentimes we talk about energy as an individual projects on a solar plant, this and that and whatever. I think there are plenty of infrastructure projects and large-scale which are absolutely critical for energy in Africa, and I think the problems lies elsewhere, and we can actually have a separate meeting about it. But part of it is also that we are in the midst of transition, and everybody is learning. This is a new system, and everybody is a little bit learning, and I think the people are a little bit more cautious going into an area that they're not accustomed to working as well. So I think there's a lot more to the story. I wouldn't agree that there's no projects, large-scale projects. I think the smaller scale projects, and this is to your question as well, I think they're a lot more difficult because they're absolutely not interesting to private sector investors because they're the small scale. Even though they might be transformative, they're just a lot more difficult. And I think this is where another idea for philanthropies, there is some ideas around the small revolving funds that can be done in communities to actually catalyze, to enable local communities to actually self-sustain, or train local institutions, financing institutions to actually lend money to families to do it themselves. And there was one more thing that I wanted to say, but I'm gonna pass this on. So.
Okay. Thank you, Fatan. So you asked a question on impact investments and where philanthropy comes in and does not come in. So philanthropy does play a part in creating the enabling environment for impact investments. And some philanthropies actually have an impact investing arm. And like the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, we did have an impact investing arm. So it is complementary. It's not one or the other, but creating the enabling environment for impact investments is something that philanthropy can do to crowd in the necessary financing.
Thank you. I think just reflecting a bit on what we've heard here and also on some of the lessons of our work on energy transition in other geographies, I think the things that it sort of seems that we need are political leadership and policy, public awareness and engagement and demand, better evidence and data, and finally partnerships. And I think there's something that philanthropy has a role to play across each of these areas, and echoing what some of my fellow panelists have said, can be nimble and flexible and catalytic, and can really help unlock and unleash and crowd in all the other actors that need to be involved in this space. And that's what I really hope can be a kind of agenda for philanthropic engagement in Africa moving forward.
Fantastic closing points, Priya. I think that sums up. I don't need to sum it up. Thank you very much. We have to now close. I'd like to thank each one of you for joining us today. And just to reiterate, certainly on behalf of the African Climate Foundation, and I think I can speak also for some of the other philanthropies, that our commitment to engage in Africa is here. And so we look forward to partnerships with as many actors as possible. Thank you very much for joining us.